Okay, hello everybody. My name is Darya. I'm a third-year PhD at the University of St. Andrews with schools of modern languages and international relations. My research is concerned with human-plant relations and displacement. And I work with Ukraine, with the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblast, more known as the Donbass region, where in 2014 a military conflict broke out and hence displacement. And looking at the way human-plants relations are disrupted, but also reconstituted in new spaces. And maybe if I can share my screen, it's not directly related to my research, but maybe it will be close to home for people in St. Andrews. Can you see it? Mm-hmm. I don't know if anybody could recognize this first photograph where you can see a reflection of me standing where it has been taken in St. Andrews.
Yes.
Just speak if somebody knows. It's a big it's a big window with plants. I don't know if anybody can think of a space that has a lot of plants and a massive window, and you can.
Is it by the library?
It is in the library, yeah. It's a collaboration space, so-called, the room that we used to use when we could actually all study together in a collaboration space. But so, you know, I'm writing about plants very often locked in home, but at homes, if, you know, people left and they didn't have time or didn't think they were not coming back within the next couple of months and they wilted. And during lockdown, walking around St. Andrews, this is not the route I would normally take, but in June I passed by the library and I noticed that the plants, and you can see the close-up, were really wilted in a collaboration space, and obviously nobody was watering them. And it really resonated with me at that moment, and it kind of relates to the same questions that I'm dealing with in my research, in how this relations between human and plants, once disrupted, affects both, and plants a lot, actually. And on the other photo, you see plants that my supervisor evacuated from the quad when she gained access in July. And so she just took these plants from the corridor and called me, and I got them and I've been nurturing them since then. But if you can imagine that in a local kind of St. Andrews context, this is very similar questions I'm dealing with in my research. And quite interesting, actually, if you think about lockdown and pandemic, there have been so many articles appearing in Vogue and in Independent about the way plants and house plants benefit our mental health and how we've all been bonding with them during the lockdown, but very little reflection about the way plants are affected. And I think that's what I'm trying to do in my research, is look at both sides and the way kind of crisis as displacement in Ukraine affects the plants, which not many people talk about. And I guess I'll stop here. I don't know how to. Let us press exit. No. Sorry. Here you go. Okay, I stopped sharing, right? So I'll just stop here and pass on the word to whoever's next. But thank you for having me.
I think your screen is still sharing, Darya.
No. Really? Uh-oh.
Is it for everyone else?
No, it's not.
Okay,
No, it's okay.
Mine must have crashed. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
So if we could move on to Maythe, maybe?
Sure. Hi, I'm Maythe. I'm a Korean-Canadian PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh in anthropology right now, and I research multi-species kinship between dogs and their humans and its implications in Edinburgh and also on the internet. That's it for me.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. Maybe move on to Matheus now?
Okay. Yeah, so hello, everybody. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Matheus. I'm from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro. And no, I didn't vote for Bolsonaro, so no, don't be afraid of me. And I just finished my PhD in France, and I just start here as a postdoctoral research in St. Andrews. So my PhD project, so my thesis was about, I'm a historian, so my thesis was about the history of bubonic plague and I tried to write a global history of this disease and showing how it created what I called a space of circulation of knowledge, and how this space connected people working in Brazil, in India, and in France, in the Pasteur Institute. So how can you imagine, since I was studying plague, the role of rats, it was central in my thesis, and then now for the postdoc, I will try to develop it, because I'm now working in a very large project called the Global War Against the Rats and the Epistemic Emergence of Zoonosis. So the idea is to understand how this medical concept, the zoonosis, coronavirus is a zoonosis as well. So how these concepts emerged and how other concepts emerged with it. For instance, the concept of reservoir or epizootics and many others. So, and for the project, I will also work on Brazil, India, France, and the United States. But I'm now trying to write a book about. Okay, I'm planning to do it at the end of the project, and my idea is to write a book about how the rats were conceived at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the next century, as a universal object and also as a universal problem, and also the limits of this universalistical approach. So my idea is to try to understand how the doctors and politicians, because they thought they were seeing the same problem in Brazil or in India or in France, they thought that, okay, the rat is some universal object, and that it changed the perception with this animal and also with the disease like plague, but not only plague, but okay. And that's my plan for the future. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Move on to Nathaniel now.
Hi, I'm Nathaniel Johnson. I'm a journalist in California, and I write books as well. And I wrote one book on essentially this topic, on encountering other species in our daily lives. And I was really driven to it by a perception change that was brought about by having a small child. And I would just be eternally frustrated by trying to accomplish some very important adult objective, like walking down the block to buy groceries, and my small child would notice something fascinating and disgusting in the gutter and would be distracted by this and would want me to come back and look. And then if I actually had the ability to come back and see what she was seeing, I would always find something interesting there. And so it made me remember that when I was younger, I had a slightly different relationship with the natural world. I could see things rather than simply rushing by. I would be entranced by them. And so the book takes about 10 species that we come into contact with every day in cities around the world and tries to imbue them with the same sense of wonder that you get when you go to a place that's given the authority of majesty. You go to a national park or someplace where the natural world is sort of held up for exaltation. And so I'm really interested in trying to understand why we have this sense of wonder, why our perception changes in some places and not in others, why we tend to think of nature in terms of its utility or its nuisance factors in some places, and in other places we exalt it and see it as a sort of religious icon that we can't touch and must be protected. So that's the essence of my interest in this.
Okay, I think that leads really well into our first question, which is, how has your work changed the way that you look at the world? So if we could maybe start with Matheus this time.
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think because one of my main approach to my thesis, and the same approach that I'm trying to use now in my postdoc, is the approach of the global history, and I think what's the most interesting with this approach is to understand that that we, like humans, we share something. Of course, there is a lot of cultural, linguistical, and social barriers, but there is something that we can share, and then we can sometimes understand each other, and we can construct some interaction, some connectiveness. So that's, and that was something that I tried to explain during my thesis, and this point changed completely my way to look at the world. So that's the idea that we because sometimes we have this kind of approach to understand the world like some blocks of or civilizations, but if we look at these as a global process, sometimes I think we can understand that there is it's possible to communicate with each other. So that's what we are doing now. So everybody's speaking in English here, and that's not the language of it's not my language. Maybe it's not the language of or not the mother language of you. So, but we are trying to understand each other, and we are trying to create some horizon of communication. So that's the point that I try to stress in my thesis, and I think it's completely changed my approach to the world now.
That's really, really interesting. Maybe we could move on to Maythe now.
Sure. Yeah, like my work for sure has changed the way that I look at the world. And I mean, I've always loved dogs, and I cared about them, but to conceptualize them as our kin, and to learn about the ways in which our kinship is practiced, understood, used, and even abused, it's instilled a new sense of responsibility in me with regard to how I should live in this world, I think. But on the other hand, it's also physically changed the way that I look at the world, right? It's kind of similar to what Nathaniel brought up. I think about seeing the world from a dog's perspective as much as possible as a vital care practice. So I need to look out for small critters that my dog might chase after, or what I call street bread or street chicken that my dog really shouldn't eat, or for dirty, puddle water that they shouldn't drink from, or motorcycles that they're reactive toward. So I think my work has also taught me to embody dog subjectivity in this way.
That's brilliant. Maybe we should move on to Nathaniel next then.
I think this particular inquiry for me, it taught me to value this more childlike form of perception, of course. And I think that's something that we all sort of say we'd like to do. We'd like to stop and slow down and smell the roses and learn the names of the plants and animals that share our neighborhoods with us. But when it actually comes to it, it's really freaking hard to do, and you don't want to stop interrupting the necessities of daily life to actually do that. And so it made me appreciate that necessity and the benefits that come from doing that, both the personal benefits. There's sort of a mindfulness practice that you get out of that, but also I think that there's some real benefits for our encounters with other species, as Maythe was just talking about. If we can kind of expand the limits of our subjectivity a little bit, we're a lot less likely to stomp around the world with big feet and act ignorantly. It also made me appreciate that both of these forms of the way we perceive the world are useful. I mean, it's not enough to simply go around the world completely as a child. The bills still have to be paid. That we still have to extract resources from nature to sustain ourselves. And so I think that the realization that there are these two forms of perception that you can kind of tap into, and if we can mindfully alternate between those things and value both of them, I think that would be beneficial to the world. And that for me seemed like an insight, and has certainly changed the way I move through the world.
That's great. That really brings me back to thinking of myself as a child. I actually went on holiday once, and all I photographed the entire time was pigeons. Like, literally, my entire camera roll was just pigeons, because I was obsessed with them. I thought that they were so cool. But yeah, we'll move on to Darya next.
Yeah, I can. What Maythe and Nathaniel said about also kind of the physical shift in perspective, definitely. I can relate to that. And in my case, when I started my PhD, I didn't start it as a multi-species project. I started as a project on displacement only, and I interviewed people about cities and homes, and asked them to draw mental maps. And only kind of the midway through looking at these maps and interviews, the plants really stood out for me, and I started to kind of read more about plants, and started to own some of the house plants, and eventually my room is slowly turned into the garden. So for a lot of people who know me after I discovered this topic, they think it started the opposite way. So I always loved plants and decided to research, but actually it came from the research itself. But it definitely changes my perspective in a small sense. Like I pay attention to light, right? I pay attention to temperature, if there is drought in a room, and how the plants would feel, and every room I come in, I kind of immediately probably scan it. Would a plant feel okay here? But also I think speaking, beyond plants, which obviously, there's a term plant blindness that we don't notice usually plants in spaces, right? So that I think helped me to overcome my plant blindness, but also kind of, I think it made me look at myself differently. So realize to which extent I coexist with others, to which extent I'm my own microbiome, and really kind of see the phenomenon of being human as a transspecies phenomenon. So I think in that way it really decentered kind of my perspective on my own self. Yeah.
That's really interesting. So I think I'm going to go back to something that Darya was talking about in her introduction when she was talking about COVID. Very up to date. So the question I'm going to ask is, how does a pandemic-informed world affect the way that we view animals in our everyday lives? And it goes beyond animals, actually. Could the COVID pandemic be a turning point for our multi-species interactions, e.g. with microbes and things like that? So I'll start with Nathaniel, maybe.
Sure. The first thing that comes to mind, I mean, obviously your last point about microbes is the most salient, but the first thing that comes to mind isn't microbes, but fauna around people's homes. When the quarantine first started, there were loads of news stories about how nature was healing. I don't know if you remember these. It feels like decades ago now, but people noticed for the first time that there were coyotes coming into their neighborhoods, that there were fish in the canals, and in a lot of cases, in some cases perhaps there was a little bit more wildlife activity in town, towns because there's less traffic. But in many of these cases that I saw, and I researched a few of them, what really had changed was the perception. People had slowed down enough, and they were home, and they were looking outside in the middle of the day. They were at their windows, and they were able to see these creatures that had always been there. So I think the pandemic has really enforced a strict localism on the world. You know, we've been forced to stop moving around so quickly, get off the airplanes, and pay attention to the people and the creatures that are immediately next to us. And so people have gotten more interested in their non-human neighbors, as well as the microbial neighbors.
That's a really interesting point. My boyfriend actually started bird watching during the lockdown, so
yes,
I really connect with that. Does anyone else have anything to add?
Yeah, okay.
Yep.
I would like to add, but in a historical perspective. So I think it starts with the pandemic of plague, what it's called the third pandemic. This idea that the rats are linked to the disease, because before this pandemic, the rats were sometimes blamed because they are eating the food, but not they are causing the disease. They are transmitting the disease. But it's with this pandemic that for the first time there is an idea that these animals that we are talking about animals, about rats that we live with these animals. No, it's not like a pangolin. It's completely far away from here. Now we talk about rats. Okay, so and this construction about the idea that the rats are dangerous, it's emerged at the same time with the idea of the tropical medicine that insects were also dangerous. So and I think it was at this moment, so at the beginning of the last century, that we have this kind of framework to show that the animals are dangerous in a health perspective. And with COVID, we saw it at the beginning. Maybe the bats are linked to the disease, or the pangolin, or are these animals something like a reservoir for the disease? But with the evolution of the pandemic, I think now we completely forgot it, and now it's a problem between humans. No, it's not much more a problem with humans and animals in the sense of the evolution of the pandemic. With I think it's very interesting because it's completely different from this point of view of the pandemic of plague, that the rats are always blamed, or at least at the beginning, no, but since the pandemic starts, the rats are blamed, and here we don't have it. But if I can also make another historical comparison, it's with plague and also with cholera that, and it was very important here in Europe and also in the United States to not only blame the rats but also blame people, like people from Asia, people from China, from India. So this idea of the yellow peril, no, and I think it's still there. And I think COVID, in a sense, refashioned this idea of the yellow peril. And I can say that from a Brazilian perspective, that at the beginning of the pandemic, of COVID pandemic, now in Brazil, Bolsonaro coping Trump, he was saying all the time, oh, it's a Chinese virus. So I can see like a connection between these old ideas from bacteriology or tropical medicine at the beginning of the century and today with COVID. Even if we don't have, I think we don't have this kind of, I cannot see this blaming, but okay, we can say that pangolin maybe is related, but they are not blaming as as the cause of the pandemic as it was the rats during the pandemic of plague.
That's brilliant. I think both Maythe and Darya have something to add, so we start with Maythe.
Sure. It's really interesting that you bring up this idea of yellow peril, because when I first thought of the question that was posed, I thought, generally I find that there is this like newfound appreciation for dogs and this affective kind of joy that they can bring us by just being physically close to us when we have to be physically distant from other people. And it's a special kind of loneliness that this pandemic can induce, because it's not that you don't have friends or family or social support, but it's that you just can't physically be close to them. You can't have physical access to them, and you have to maintain this distance, but you don't have to do that with your dog. You get to keep them close, cuddle with them, and touch them. So I think that we're realizing that we've been taking this tactile proximity for granted. But on the other hand, like Matheus said, there's a political aspect to this too. And since the pandemic, which kind of coincided with Black Lives Matter in the US and which also spread to the UK really quickly, some of my racialized participants and myself as well, we realized that we're being treated differently depending on whether we have our dogs with us or not. So I got called a chink and got spat on once when I was just running my errands without my dog. But later on the same day, when I was walking Frank, someone came up to me just to tell me that he was looking at me with such love and trust in his eyes. So yeah, 2020 has been called a year of converging crisis. And I think that the role that dogs have to play in this is really ever expansive.
Well, I'm so sorry that happened to you, but that was a really good point that you made there as well. Like, it's really important to bring up. And Darya, what did you want to say?
I just want to add that, there's research that says that the pandemics will be more common in the future, particularly with the climate crisis. And that also, you have to think of the destruction of wildlife and how that affects our relations with, animals in the wild whom we otherwise wouldn't normally encounter, because the humans push out the wildlife to such an extent that it's in our backyard in the moment, right? And the destruction of it, I think, really creates this new kind of encounters and new kind of transmissions, potentially, that wouldn't be there. But also in this discourse of climate change, I think it's sometimes it feels to me that we start panicking because we is a very weird pronoun to use here, but I always try to think of how can we learn to value the other species just for, in their own ways, not because they're useful to us or because they can help us saving our own situations. And I think that kind of thinking really should be cultivated these days. So it's not only for us, but they're valuable just because they are and not because they're anyhow instrumental to us. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. We've had a question come through, and it is, I would like to ask the panel, how do they think veterinary medicine, biomedical knowledge, shape their relations with other species in day-to-day life, as well as within veterinary clinics, laboratories, etc.? So just whoever would like to start with this one, I don't mind.
I can take a quick stab just to break the ice. I'm not sure I have any great insight into this, but one way in which that has changed things is that it's allowed for more comfort and more interaction. I mean, there was a time when, these zoonotic diseases were just this great unknown, and we had to approach rats with fear and loathing because they represented such a peril. And now because of the advances in technology, it's opened up the possibility for less fear-based communication.
That's great, thank you. Anybody else?
So something that I think about a lot in terms of veterinary medicine is how much of it is technicalities and how much of it is how we as caretakers of our animals interact with the veterinarians. So is it actually interspecies interactions, or is it intra-species interactions between humans in the name of care for animals? So I learned recently that about 85% of complaints against veterinarians that get filed is actually because of their client communication skills rather than something that they did wrong to the animal. So in that way, I wonder if in vet medicine, like how much of it is actually about the animal and how much of it is actually communicating the animal's needs from the owner's perspectives as well as the doctor's perspective.
That's really interesting. Thank you. We've had another question come through, I think. It's quite a long one. It's so interesting to hear from the panelists, and also the comment just made in the chat thinking about how contact zones, which are also often seen in post-humanities literature, seen as very generative spaces for learning to affect and be affected by non-humans, have taken on a very different tenor in the COVID moment. I think that also speaks to the terrible experience that Maythe described in certain ways as well. Do folks on the panel think more attention is needed to forms of violence also embedded in more than human care work? So just, does anyone want to have a crack at that one? Take your time.
I'm rereading this and it's still struggling to understand. Maybe some of the academics understand these words better than me.
Yeah. I'm not sure I understand what is meant here by care work. Don't know if anybody has any insights.
I'm not sure if the person who wrote it, whether they'd be able to explain it for us. You don't have to, there's no pressure.
In the meantime, can we go with Martha's question?
Yeah.
Yeah. Martha asked, I wonder, like calling May's point, like in the previous question, really fascinating, or the question before that. I wonder if anyone has been looking at sporadic reports of transmission of COVID-19 to and from non-human animals, and whether they have thoughts about the way that these stories are circulating.
I have thoughts, I think. So I think there was an instance in the UK about a cat that got COVID. And we don't know what the symptoms are like. We don't know what the prognosis is like if COVID gets transmitted to animals, to non-human animals. But I find it really interesting if we are to compare it to the stories that circulate when it's not about pets that we love. So a lot of the stories that we hear in the UK now, I think it's mostly about how there's like a new spike in transmissions and new cases, and a lot of it is about blaming undergraduate students who have been forced to move here, even though classes are going online, and they're being threatened if with like things like suspension or expulsion if they get caught leaving their dorm rooms or going to pubs or whatnot. So the differences between the reporting of these stories and who gets blamed and who gets held accountable for these things, it sometimes makes me think what kind of valuation processes in the moral economy of things there is in terms of non-human animals who we have to care for versus human animals that we also have to care for, but are seen as somehow more independent in their practice of agency. So cats are not at fault because, you know, they're under our control and they're innocent animals versus, oh, these undergraduate students, like, how dare they go grab a coffee with their friends and spread COVID.
Thank you so much. Darya?
I'm thinking, I'm not an expert on it at all, but I've been just thinking of the vaccine research and the role of primates and other animals that it's been tested. And, you know, whether we also like talk about that role, especially as we celebrate NHS workers and other people that help to stop the pandemic. Yeah, I don't know. There's more of a question in relation to this question because I'm definitely not an expert in that. But
Okay, thank you. Nathaniel, I think, has a point.
Yeah, it's just interesting as a journalist. You know, if you can write a story about animals, it always gets tons of clicks and views. People love stories about animals. And early in the pandemic, you would see there would sometimes newspapers or National Public Radio here in the U.S. Would have questions about the pandemic from kids, and they would say that the kids always wanted to know if their pets could get COVID-19, and so there's a lot of attention. I remember, you know, there was a story about, you know, this tiger in the Bronx Zoo getting the disease, and so it's really, I think Maythe's point about sort of the limits to our circle of compassion, like how we view that tiger versus, say, 200,000 people in India. You know, there's a way in which the human toll becomes just so overwhelming that it's hard for people to compass, but they're able to tap into compassions for animals that they relate to as pets. Certainly, there's other animals that are beyond that circle of compassion. It would be a really interesting survey to kind of navigate where those boundaries lie.
That's really interesting. Thank you so much. Matheus has a point.
Yeah, I'd like to come back to the point that Maythe made. That's about that there's some animals that we like, that we love, that there are other animals that we don't like. So, and that was very important during the campaigns against the rats in many places, in Brazil, in India, and because the politicians try to frame the rats as a disgusting animal. No, and because we don't like the rats, we should kill them. And that these kind of rhetorical approach and this image of the rats, it was used by the Nazis, and they try to make a point between the Jewish people and the rats, and to try to dehumanize the Jews, linking them to the rats. And what I was thinking is, let's imagine that we discovered now that the dogs or the cats, they are like the reservoirs of the COVID, and because of that we had to kill all dogs and all cats. And I think it would be we cannot imagine the kind of social riot that this kind of approach would create. But when you go to a kind of animal that we don't like, for instance, bats, let's say that we decide that let's kill all the bats or the rats. I think, but what I like with this idea that it's always a social and cultural problem. We are framing the animals from a social and cultural perspective. So yeah, that's it.
That's really, really interesting. Like, I definitely couldn't imagine if they came back and said it was dogs, how I would react to that. It's, yeah, very culturally embedded. Kindly, Jared has tried to rephrase his question for us, and he's asked, do the panelists think that the experience of COVID might reorient the kind of trajectory of multi-species research, and perhaps in what kinds of directions?
I typed out an answer in the chat. Sorry.
Oh, does anyone else have a point to make about it? Matheus?
No.
Darya, I think you're on mute.
I mean, no, I was just reading. I'm trying to like multitask between reading May's answer in the chat and
Okay.
and questions. Yeah, very interesting.
Yeah.
I think one point on this is just that I think we'll see an evolution of the metaphors that tyrants use, you know, when they're trying to vilify certain groups. You know, that may change from, you know, as we people used to be called dogs as an insult, right? And now that doesn't work so much anymore. And perhaps rats are not quite the same metaphor of disgust as they once were, although they were still pretty close. But you know, you could see that changing. You know, does it have to? I don't think if we succeed in getting people to have this larger subjectivity and identify with more species, I don't think it will put an end to that sort of kind of racist rhetoric, but I think people will just reach for other metaphors where, you know, you're comparing people to slime molds or to pathogenic viruses rather than mammals.
That's great. I think the next question that's come up is about domestic cats. Chloe wrote, domestic cats are known as an invasive species in island countries such as New Zealand, and certainly a pest species here in the UK with regards to severe declines in songbirds, native rodents and frogs. How easy do you think it would be for the public to disengage their emotional drivers of human-cat relationships in order to facilitate predator-free countries or regions such as the Predator-Free 2050 campaign in New Zealand?
Okay, I was not aware about this problem in New Zealand, and I know nothing about New Zealand, but I can believe it will be hard to the government if they try to get free from cats. Or okay, I don't know if you can try to disconnect the people from the animals like that, but I have no idea about this problem.
Maythe?
So in Scotland, I realized once I moved here that people generally seem to think that if you don't keep your cat as an outdoor cat, it's kind of cruel to the cats because it suppresses their nature. So in this case, there's a lot of tension between people who think that way versus people who, you know, say cats kill birds and cats kill all of these native species in Scotland. So what are they supposed to do? And it's just kind of unresolved and people just fight about it all the time. But to address the question more directly, I think it's going to be really, really hard for people to disengage their emotional drivers of their relationship with their cats, because them letting their cats out is an act of care. It's to nurture them and to foster their nature and to help them do what is supposed to keep them healthy. And whether that comes at the cost of some birds, you know, it's a tough issue for people to kind of grasp more systemically, I guess.
I've definitely met people that have actually been quite proud of their cats when they've caught birds and things like that. So it's a which animal is prioritized sort of situation. Darya's got a point?
Yeah, I was actually listening to this quite interesting. The hierarchies that we have, you know, so cats would be above rats in the human perception. But then when you talk about plants, it's very rarely that people think about weeding as a violent act. You know, I've been trying to like not without some parts of my garden. My neighbors definitely judge me for that because that doesn't look okay here, and they've commented many times. But when you see campaigns such as More Than Weeds, also fighting for payment plants in open spaces, how easily we classify certain plants as weeds just because they grow in spaces that we should grow. How we feel for taking them out. You know, there's not even a question most of the time that you are destroying something, and not only plants themselves, but also insects, you know, that benefit from these plants growing and really contributing to the destruction of a lot of ecosystems around. So that's quite interesting for me in terms of hierarchies of what we feel empathy with.
Yeah, that's definitely a really good point. We have another question specifically for Nathaniel this time. I was wondering about the kind of dichotomy between the plants and animals that we see in our everyday lives, growing on the roadside, fields, and in our gardens, etc., and the specially delineated spaces set up for us to appreciate the more rare and exotic species like zoos and arboretum. So I'm sorry, I'm not very good at words. I have a sense that the inquisitive nature of the European colonial projects and their insistence on glorifying things exotic has something to do with it. What do you think about this dichotomy? And how do you think we can make others appreciate the huge variety of plants and animals that we take for granted in our everyday life? Is it merely a matter of inspiring people, or do we have to critique the idea that exotic species are more interested than the species we interact with in our everyday lives?
I don't think you have to reach all the way back to the colonial project. I just think it's human to notice things that are unusual. So there's certain this is true of zoos. You know, you go and you see, wow, that is a crazy animal. I'm not used to seeing that in my daily life. We're tuned to newness, right? And that's true with landscapes as well. So there's a reason that when you go to Yosemite National Park here in California, you stop and you look around at these sheer granite walls reaching thousands of feet into the air, and your jaw drops. There's a strangeness to the place that forces you to stop and pay attention, and to simply observe, rather than moving through that space bent on a single objective of, you know, making a little more money or finding food for the day or paying your rent. It forces you to stop and look around because it is exotic. And so, yeah, how do you stop and notice the things that are everyday and appreciate them? It's a harder project for sure. But the point that I try to make with my work is that it's rewarding, and there is, if you stop and slow down enough, there is fascination there. There is wonder to be found. So I list all these these cool facts about these strange weeds and or not strange, very normal weeds and pigeons and rats and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think for myself, I get real enjoyment when I actually go out in the autumn and I just see the leaves everywhere. It's a really beautiful thing that not everyone picks up on, and they sometimes just think, oh, it's cold out here, and that's about it. I think Hannah would like to make a point, so if she'd like to speak, that's fine.
Yeah, hello. Also about the point of like noticing the species that are actually around us, and maybe particularly noticing these species that we dislike. For my dissertation, I read a book called The Voice of the Infinite in the Small, which was particularly about our perceptions of insects that are usually disliked, and juxtaposing the more Western view of these insects to indigenous views, and how they have, through time, created this collective memory and history with these certain species that we usually vilify. And so there were a lot of examples of just stories that are commonly shared within some indigenous cultures that paint a more beautiful picture of these animals, even though they are not perceived as that beautiful from our perspective. And so one example that I remember particularly was well, unfortunately, I can't remember the exact indigenous nation that creates these stories, but basically one of the Native American ethnic groups considered mosquitoes to be, and actually not just mosquitoes, everything in the natural world, but particularly mosquitoes, to be part of their ancestors. And so mosquitoes biting them or stinging them was actually perceived as ancestors reaching out, and ancestors just saying, hello, how are you feeling? And just like the normal conversation that we would have with other humans that are actually still alive, they perceived as like an opportunity for us to communicate with our ancestors. And these communications and these connections were sorry, I haven't been speaking English in the past week, so my language is also going downhill. But what I wanted to say was that they try to communicate this connection to mosquitoes through stories, through children's stories about ancestors connecting to humans through mosquitoes, for example. And so I think stories, because they enhance the imagination, and I feel like if you grow up with some positive stories about animals that you would maybe nowadays not usually perceive as that positive, if you grow up with these kind of stories and you hear them over and over, it can really change your perspective. So I think there's this cultural aspect to these kind of connections that really, like, if we make it part of our education system, and if we actually make it part of our agenda to improve our views of vilified animals, and to actually make us notice those animals that are around us instead of just exotic species, I think there definitely would be a way. It would just need to actually be prioritized more in our everyday lives. Yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
That was brilliant. Thank you so much. Darya?
I have a question. Oh, sorry.
Can I add to? Yeah. Just actually on the power of storytelling and notice in the everyday. For the people who are in St. Andrews, I don't know if you've been to the Botanic Garden recently, but there is a new director, and they were also been doing a bit of rewilding. And I went on Harry Watkins is the new director, and he gave a great talk and walk through the garden. And lots of people who came, and not even for the talk, but I've seen people been quite outraged with the state of the garden, because it doesn't present the your usual kind of colonial display of plants. And people on a walk, they were quite vocal about, like, oh, but I come here and I want to see this part of the world I will never travel. I want to see, like, this South African corner, which, as Harry Watkins explained, wouldn't be actually accurate anyway. And even if it was in the state the garden used to be before. But quite interestingly, as we walked, we saw a wild orchid growing in one of the parts that is not mowed anymore. And he stopped and he talked about the way this orchid was probably dormant for some time, and because nobody mowed the lawn, it came to life, and the kind of interconnections. And the way he shared the story really, maybe if I was walking, because I know still quite little about so many plants, I would miss it. But that storytelling really made the experience powerful. But also thinking it's the kind of, exactly what Hannah was saying, the kind of stories you are telling, and how they shift our perception of what the garden is for. What is the experience of the Botanic Garden? Are you going there just, to see this species presented taxonomically with the Latin names and kind of on display? Or are you going to look at the relations between different species in space? I thought it was quite powerful. But anyway, if anybody in St. Andrews, really recommend to go on a walk if they do more of them. Yeah.
Yes, the Botanic Gardens is great, and it's also free for students, if you didn't know that. So Nathaniel actually had a question going back to Hannah. I don't know if you want to say it to her, Nathaniel, or I can read it out if you'd like.
Well, I don't know if you have this information, but I'm just so curious about empathy for mosquitoes, as someone who's been surrounded by swarms of bloodsuckers. If you see them as ancestors, do you simply let them bite you? How do you know how people of that culture would deal with mosquitoes?
Yeah, so I mean, actually, I think this is really interesting because mosquitoes are the one species that I also really struggle with accepting in my environment. And so when I read that book, I also thought it was just very interesting because yeah, their solution, or not even solution, but basically they just accept mosquitoes biting them, which yeah seems definitely strange to me. But then another thing that I thought of now was that actually that doesn't come from that book, but I did a year abroad in Canada at Western University, and there we went to an indigenous reserve, and we're talking to the indigenous people there. And one of the indigenous students actually shared a story because I actually brought up that exact same topic. I said that I can see how every species has their purpose, or even without their purpose in the environment, they should still live, except for mosquitoes. And then she shared this story. Basically, that was what I said. And so I asked her like what her perspective on that is. And she shared this story again that she grew up hearing when she was a kid, and it was about how in the early times there was a group of people that were living in a forest, and they had to hunt in order to survive, and that was perceived as the normal situation. But they were allowed to hunt everything except for bears, and that was just something that was instilled in them from early on, and over years and years that's what they continued doing. But then there was one winter where they couldn't find any species except for bears. And so there was the part of the group that said, no, we need to try to survive without actually hunting these bears. And then there was the other group that said, come on, we should just kill one bear in order to survive. And so in the end, they did kill the bear and ate it. Well, they didn't eat it because they wanted to eat it. So they were trying to light a fire and cook it. That's probably not the right word, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
And then what happened was actually that out of this bear, a huge swarm of mosquitoes evolved. And so out of this, like cooking this bear, mosquitoes were created. And so she said that the moral of the story was that if we now kill these mosquitoes because they are an inconvenience, because we can't live with that, something even worse would come out of that, and that we should just accept that their existence is not supposed to necessarily serve us, but that us interrupting this existence might put us in a more negative place than we are in at the moment. And that stuck with me now for like 2 years, and I really like that story. So I have definitely not necessarily changed my entire perspective on mosquitoes, but I definitely try to not kill them even when they're bothering me. Yeah, these are my thoughts.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for your input. So going on from animals that people vilify, I was thinking we could talk a little bit more about how you personally view rats. So whoever would like to start, I don't mind. Yeah, Matheus?
Sorry, I'm muted. I was muted. Okay. Yeah. Okay. For a personal point of view, I think we have to think about there's no ideal rat. No, we can encounter the rats at least in two situations. No, there's the rat in the sense that not a in this traditional idea that's something related to disease and to filth and etc. But also there is some people who have rats as pets. No, it's and there is no the rat is not a rat per se. Is a rat in relation with someone, or no. But if I can say much more in a personal point of view, that's what I like with rats is that the rats they sometimes disturb the idea that we have about the world. And what I'm saying about that, because as I I said at the beginning of my presentation, and it was very strong here in the UK or even in France, the idea that the tropics are dangerous, and of course the North or Europe and North America are not. And please go, if you go to Paris, I lived 3 years in Paris. That's why I'm saying that. I think you have much more chance to see a rat that you can see a rat in Rio de Janeiro. So, and it's a really a problem in Paris. And so what I like with the rats is that they can sometimes defy our understanding of the world and of these very well-built categories and how we imagine the world. So the rats, they show that's not so easy and not so simple to understand the world.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much for your input. Does anyone else have anything to say?
Also, I think at this point we can stop the recording.
Yep.
So thank you everybody for coming. We're gonna have another 20 minutes of Q&A without the recording. So if anybody would feel more comfortable that way, that would be great. Thank you everybody for listening to the first series in like our multi-species panels or webinars, and we'll hope that we'll bring you another webinar soon. Yeah, thank you very much.